Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope it's been a good day so far. Again, my name is Alex Kostura, and I work with ConsenSys. We're the largest pure play blockchain company in the world. And I will lead our DC team, working mostly with the public sector and social impact clients and partners. Formerly of the State Department, so I'm a former international development practitioner. I like to tell people that so they know that I'm not a technologist. I'm coming at this from a similar angle that many of you in the room are. Very pleased to introduce my panelists today, and I'm actually going to have them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves, what you do, and why you find yourself on a blockchain panel. So why don't we start with Yuliya Panfil from New America.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yuliya Panfil, and I am not a blockchain expert. Let me start with that. I am, like Alex, coming out of the international development field. I run a program at the think tank New America called The Future of Property Rights. And the foundational question around which our program was incubated is, why is it that we have all of these new technologies, from blockchain to dual band GPS to self-sovereign identity, high accuracy mapping that have advanced all over the world. And at the same time, you have an estimated 2 billion people all around the world who have insecure land and property rights. And part of the reason, we believe, is that there's a fundamental disconnect between technologists and policymakers in the land and property rights space. So really, our program works to bridge the gap between policy and technology when it comes to land and property rights. Before joining New America, I was part of the Omidyar Network Property Rights Investments team, and then prior to that, also coming out of government, I was part of the land tenure team at USAID. Really pleased to be here.
Hi, I'm Jolyne, and I'm currently the sector director for land tenure and property rights at Tetra. Tetra is a very big domestic and international consulting firm, and I'm part of their international development group based in Arlington, Virginia. I wanted to say that I've been in the business of international development for about 35 years, and the issue of land and property rights has always been part of my portfolio and near and dear to my heart. And I would say somewhere along the way, I started funding projects that were investing in technologies to improve land registries, and at some point maybe became an honorary land technologist, even though I don't do the technologies, I don't do the program and coding, and the same thing's true with blockchain, like my colleagues here. So I know about its applicability and its basics, but I'm not a blockchain expert. And I'm here for the same reason as Yuliya and Alex, because we think that there needs to be more of a conversation between people like ourselves and people like those of you in the audience who are true blockchain technologists.
Great. Thank you both so much. So wonderful panel. And I assured them at the beginning that this should be a panel of domain experts and not blockchain experts, and that's okay. There's too many people running around claiming to be blockchain experts when really the space needs people who understand the application and the domains really well. So with that, the title of our panel is Blockchain and Land Titles. Blockchain, we're all familiar with what that is. That's why we're here. It's really used. It's sort of a general term used to describe a suite of technologies at this point, or a set of protocols. I typically say a digital, distributed, decentralized ledger. But land titles, for those in the room who don't know, like, what are land titles, Jolyne? Could you tell us what those are, and also why we're talking about them in the context of a blockchain conference?
Although I wanted to start out by saying if I could change the title of the session, I would, and I would change it to Land Titles for Blockchain instead of the other way around. And let me bring you to that perspective, and it's because I have a point of view about what needs to happen to tap into the real potential of blockchain. But let me start out with a basic definition. So land titles are basically one of a variety of ways that people's rights, property rights to land, housing, and other kinds of real property are documented in a way that is legally recognized. Right? And so in some countries, you might have a certificate of ownership or a title deed to a lease, or there's many types of documents. In the U.S., land title is the predominant model, as well as deeds for when you make a transfer of rights. So it's a way of acknowledging the owner of a piece of property in a legally viable way. Those land titles need to be archived in a registry system, or typically would be archived in a land registry. In the United States, if any of you own property here, you might have had to register, or someone registered on your behalf in a county clerk's office or at a courthouse at a very local level, usually at the county level. In most of the countries that Yuliya and I work in, there's a national property registry, and sometimes decentralized offices of that, sometimes also registries at the county level, but typically you would have a national property registry and or a land administration system that connects the titles to the maps of the parcels that the titles cover. So why am I bothering telling you all of that is because those land registries archive the documents and they archive the records of changes. So when there's a sale, when there's a mortgage, when there's a bequeathment or inheritance, those get recorded there. And it's the registry and those change processes, not the titles per se, that blockchain can add value to. So I'm bringing you around to the reverse order. So blockchain can, in my view, add value to the registry through decentralized access, through increasing transparency, reducing corruption, potentially maybe cost and efficiency. That's talked about a lot, but in my view, there's really been no hard evidence that that's true. And maybe even secure payment. So one of the ways to make access decentralized is allowing people to pay at distance. And so blockchain having a layer with cryptocurrencies could do that potentially. But if you want to tap that benefit of blockchain, and here's where I'm coming back to why I would change the title, right, is I think and to be revolutionary or to really have any significant impact, most of the properties in the country have to be registered and titled. And the sad reality is in many, many countries, that's not the case. Some countries, up to 90% of the parcels of land are not documented in the first place. They don't have a land title or a certificate or anything else, much less being registered. Thank you.
Yuliya, anything you want to add?
Sure. I'm in violent agreement with everything Jolyne said. And I want to just kind of put an even finer point on this very last point that Jolyne made, because I think that this is really critically important, in the evaluation and research space. We have this saying, garbage in, garbage out, right? And I think that the blockchain for land discussion sometimes suffers from this malady. As Jolyne said, in order to implement a blockchain solution for land titles, you have to have those land titles to begin with, right? According to the World Bank, 70% of land all over the world is not yet registered. That number is even higher in Africa. On the African continent, 90%, an estimated 90% is not registered. So what are you going to put on the blockchain, right? And I think that this is a really critical element for us to understand within the land and property rights sector. I definitely think that there are applications of blockchain for land, but I think we have to get really crystal clear on what blockchain can and can't solve in our sector. And I just want to also say one thing. Jolyne is absolutely correct that while we have formal titles here in the US and much of Western Europe, all over the world, there are very different types of property ownership, right? Sometimes it's individual, sometimes it's communal. There may be community titles or community occupancy certificates or different forms of rentals. Land doesn't have to necessarily be owned outright as a freehold title for it to be registered on the blockchain, but I do think that there needs to be some sort of documentation of that ownership or use or relationship first for that to then be available for a blockchain solution.
Thank you. So I'm hearing that there are big blockers and potentially challenges to applicability, but let's start with the hype side first. So what do you think are the applications that you see in this space, and then maybe talk a little bit too about specifically to developing countries?
Yeah, so I would say that to my mind, fraud and trust are probably reducing fraud and increasing trust are probably the two most promising applications. Land and property for many people, maybe most people around the world, is their most valuable asset. So it's incredibly important. And in an agrarian society, it's not just, land isn't just where you put your house. It's your job, and it's your place in society. It's your identity. So this asset is critical to people around the world, and it's also, as far back as as history has been written, has been subject of intense corruption and theft, right? Land grabbing, governments taking people's land, expropriating it, giving it to big companies, grafting it for themselves. So there is in much of the world this really intense culture of distrust around land transactions and land holdings. And I'll speak a little bit later about Georgia as a good example of this. But, so I think that a system that can, reduce fraud and tampering in the land sector and improve security of those records, the fact that, with a blockchain system makes land records significantly more tamper-proof, immutable, can be really powerful for increasing public trust in the land sector. I would say secondary benefits, as Jolyne mentioned, speed, cost, also interoperability. So in many places, the land registries that hold land records don't actually speak to any of the other government departments. So even if you have a land document, it's really hard to actually extract value from it. It's difficult for that information to be used by a Ministry of Agriculture or a land management service or a mapping agency. It's hard for people to take that document to a bank and get a loan. So I think that the promise of kind of interoperability and ease of transaction is also a really important one.
Jolyne, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I would. And so I don't disagree with that. I also think that, like many things in the land sector, it depends, and it depends on context for all the reasons that we've said. So I think one example that I know of, and I can't say that I really know a lot about it because I didn't have time to really do some digging and homework, but for example, where there's an effort to create a clean slate in the sense of the garbage in, garbage out part of the equation, or in other words, get the land records in order, finish titling, et cetera, then potentially you can achieve some of or many of the things that Yuliya was pointing out as potential benefits, and that like the state of Andhra Pradesh in India is doing that, and they are both putting the registry on a blockchain, a permissioned blockchain, not a public blockchain, and then they're also having a smart workflow kind of application. I think the smart workflows are pretty important. Why can Andhra Pradesh do that? Well, it became a new state, right? It's a new state as of maybe 2 years ago, I'm not sure, but a couple years ago. It's a new state, and so they have to set everything up for their government and review records and all that, and they're doing that. And so there's an effort in which the slate is being cleaned so that maybe the garbage in, garbage out problem is not as bad, put it that way. I also know of, and I don't think the person I met this morning, Mauricio, I don't think is here, but there's a small pilot that was done in Colombia. Oh, there you are, yeah. So we can talk to him more about this one, but and I'm also going to sit down with him and learn more about it. But a small example in Colombia where the National Land Agency is, as far as I know, not moving yet to put the land records on the blockchain, but looking at smart workflows and making the processes of moving a title through the application to award of a title and then its registration more efficient and maybe less subject to other kinds of problems that Yuliya mentioned. Another thing that, unfortunately, our colleague Anand Anchal from the World Bank wasn't able to come today, but one thing that she often points out that I think is fascinating is the potential of blockchain to address a challenge around women's land rights. So women, there's a lot of inequality in land rights, and particularly women as part of a couple or part of a customary community, for example, might not have their rights recognized. So blockchain can fractionalized assets registered on a blockchain. I'm not sure if I'm articulating that right, but the potential to register partial rights in the same property in a way that is immutable and less prone to corruption, I think is fascinating. I think it's one of the bigger potential applications. And then also potentially fractionalized investment in land access. So for example, this is, I don't know if there's any real example, it's just something I thought of, but if you think about people who send remittances and then maybe they want to help their family member buy a piece of land, maybe more than one person can invest in that more easily, and they can certainly do that today, but more easily and with more traceability of their piece of that investment through a blockchain solution. So I don't know if you wanted to give country examples as well, or are we not there yet?
Let's hold for those. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
So those would be my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. So very promising benefits in terms of trust, combating fraud and corruption. Some specific examples that I think for most people in the room, and coming from, frankly, when I was at the State Department, these are the things that got me really excited and was like, oh man, we need to be getting into this and exploring this more. But we also talked about before this panel about the kind of hype cycle of blockchain, and how if you're sitting in the social impact space specifically, this was one of those use cases that you heard about right away. This is the one that everyone was talking about. 2016, 17. There was a lot of proofs of concepts out there, maybe even some pilots. I don't know if any of them got that far, to be honest. A lot of exciting work and a lot of talk. But I'm wondering, with you two that have been kind of watching this space and observing and participating in some of these projects, which use cases are real and have actually happened and maybe are happening currently, like the Colombia example, and which ones do you wish people would stop talking about? Or you can put it in a more positive way if you like.
Sure, I can jump in. So I don't know if any of you were in the room for the last panel. My colleague from New America, Tamika, was speaking. I don't know if he spoke about this example, but New America has been involved with the Republic of Georgia in a blockchain for land effort. And, in the Republic of Georgia, in the early aughts under Mikhail Saakashvili, as part of a kind of government cleanup, anti-corruption effort, 2 agencies that had previously been handling land records were merged into a central land registry, and all of the land records in Georgia were digitized. So Georgia had has a full registry with fully digitized land records, but unfortunately, public trust in those land records remained low. So the public remained skeptical, afraid that officials could come in, tamper with those records, alter those records. So, despite the fact that Georgia had digitized records and also the transaction times were actually quite quick. So, according to the World Bank's Doing Business Index, Georgia ranks 3rd in the world on ease of registering property. It only takes a day in Georgia. Nevertheless, the trust remained quite low. So in 2016, the Republic of Georgia and Bitfury embarked on an effort to put the records on a blockchain. And specifically, it wasn't, kind of a full land to blockchain operation. They had put a timestamping layer, right, and a hash on these records. So the front end of the system looked the same to a user who was logging on trying to register property, but on the back end there was a timestamp. So far, the last figure I heard was that 1.5 million titles had been, had been augmented in this way. I would point out this example because I think it's really interesting, partly because it solves very well for the problem that it was supposed to solve for. So in Georgia, the problem wasn't that the land wasn't registered. The problem wasn't that the land records weren't digitized. There was this very specific problem, and the problem was trust. And blockchain is well equipped to address that problem. And I think that for that reason, that example, that use case is a promising one. And we've seen something similar in Dubai as well, where, they're getting even more sophisticated and looking at, implementing blockchain for mortgages and for land transactions. Again, it's a more sophisticated system where property is largely registered and digitized. So I would say that, I would put that forward as an interesting example to look at. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, so I'll just add a couple things. One is a general point that I think needs to be heard, which is, so I think all the cases that we know about, whether it's the Georgia case or Dubai or Sweden or places in the U.S., Vermont, for example, some maybe in Zambia, Ghana, I think they're all real. Whether they're replicable and whether they're succeeding is a different question. And I don't think there's enough attention at all to trying to do some kind of evaluation or even assessment and making it public around the question that Yuliya asked, is it solving the problem that is it targeting the right problem, and is it having the impacts that were expected in terms of efficiency or transparency or anti-corruption? I don't know if there's any, and Yuliya, you might know more than I do, but I don't think there's any really good evaluations like that. Maybe it's too young to start doing that, but that's just a general point. I also wanted to mention a couple things. One is a real example that really didn't work, and the companies, Factum and Epigraph, realized it fairly early after making a big splash that they were going to really revolutionize property and get rid of corruption in Honduras. That was one of the really early cases, right, that came out. It might have been one of the first or the first, I'm not sure. That blockchain was going to be the savior of the property registry system in Honduras, and they realized relatively early on that unlike Georgia, the prerequisites, the building blocks, were not there. And so they backed out, basically. So that was an unsuccessful start. And maybe they had good reasons to think that it could work, but as they started working more closely with the government and people in Honduras, they realized that some of the problems that we've been mentioning, or challenges that need to be addressed at the same time, were not in place. And that brings me to another example that is up and coming. And it seems to be getting somewhere, and that is Medici Land Governance is working with Lusaka City government in Zambia. Medici Land Governance is a kind of like a social enterprise, I guess, created by Overstock.com CEO, Patrick Byrne, and they're doing something really interesting, and they are basically doing the work of land titling with the city of Lusaka on city land, right? And they're doing the titling, and then they're building the blockchain solution to manage those records and to also help improve tax collection. So fiscal finance kind of application. It's relatively early, but it seems like it's working. They're going to do another phase of work now after a kind of early pilot. A couple things to stress there is Lusaka City is not the whole of Zambia. And in fact, there are 3 land registries in Zambia, and probably Lusaka City's registry leaves out about 90% of the property. So if the claim is we're doing a blockchain solution to help all poor people have secure land rights in Zambia, that's not the problem it's fixing. It is fixing and helping with a problem, but it's not that one, right? So again, this message of what are we targeting and where are the real applications, and kind of building it from an entry point that makes sense, then I think we're going to see traction. And then one other thing that's very interesting, to me at least, and I have to say I'm on an advisory board for this, so maybe I have a particular interest in it, but and it hasn't started yet, but it's a business plan, and will be starting very soon, and that is by Heifer International in partnership with some other organizations. They're going to, do you guys know what Heifer International is? It's an NGO that started out a long time ago by literally helping poor people by giving them a young cow as an asset, right? And they've moved now into broader supply chain work in the ag sector to kind of move the poor families that had started to succeed further up into value chain and further livelihood development. So it's really interesting, but what they're doing is they've been using blockchain solutions for traceability and supply chains. And so now what they want to do is develop a model where those same farmers that, say, in Honduras or in the cacao value chain, or some other value chain somewhere else, can have a blockchain-enabled solution to finance land purchase and also work with the local government in those same places to potentially improve the registry in the ways that we've been talking about. So to me, that's interesting because it is taking advantage of an existing blockchain solution and a kind of context where the demand and supply for the problem being solved is aligned in a way that often isn't the case. So I think there's more incentive when there's the benefits of having a clean land title and a land title registered on a good local registry are better when the economic benefits of doing that are going to happen in the more near term. So I think it's pretty interesting because it aligns incentives. So I'll stop there.
So is it fair to say, I was hoping you guys would just like bust it apart and say this is all crap and why people will stop talking about it. But to be controversial, no. So is it fair to say that you remain optimistic about some of the benefits we talked about, as long as we're clear-eyed about the challenges, and probably most importantly, we're clear-eyed about what's the problem that we're trying to solve. A colleague of mine at ConsenSys often says like blockchain is a technology in search of a problem, or also uses the metaphor of a hammer looking around for nails. And then he turns around and says, but really what you should be thinking about is that it's a new tool, but it's more like a telescope. It's allowing you to see things in a different way. And I always like that metaphor a lot because, with the Georgia example, for example, you were talking about how the real problem wasn't quite that it was digitized or that it was a convenient process, that it was automated in many ways, but it was that the governance and the way that that asset was tracked and recorded and really governed was the issue, that there was trust, and that's something that blockchain proposes to help resolve. So I said that how much time do we have left, Ramesh? Are we?
We are doing good. We have 10 more minutes. Maybe after we can open up the floor for.
Do you mind if we jump right to Q&A with the audience? Was there anything burning that you wanted to talk about with regard to the challenges? I know I had queued that one up as well.
I just want to make one more point on the challenges, and that is that there's also an issue, particularly, well, actually in the U.S. and in other countries, but maybe more acute in developing countries, and that is the enabling policy environment that I don't think is being paid enough attention to at all. And that's the same thing was true when we started digitizing land records in the first place. But in the U.S., if you sell your land or you buy a piece of land, for that to be valid, it has to be by law recorded in a local county clerk's office or the court, right? Or it's not a valid transaction. And so if you have everything on the blockchain and you don't change that law, you're going to have to keep both running, right? Otherwise the transactions won't be valid. So some states, Ohio, Arizona, Vermont, have passed laws to do that. In the developing world, there are a host of other policy issues that probably need to be addressed as well before the blockchain solutions can have their fullest impact.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add couple more thoughts. So New America, we last spring put out a report on blockchain for land where we had identified about a half dozen use cases that we thought were interesting, that were just in the pilot, starting out POC phase. And this spring, we had originally intended to follow up that report by kind of updating where all of those efforts were. And as we started, and I won't kind of name check any of the efforts, but, as we started going into it and researching, we realized that progress was really spotty and fitful. And we started asking why. And so instead, our paper turned into a sort of, prerequisites, not a technical prerequisites paper, but, this description of what do we see as the legal, institutional, organizational prerequisites for a blockchain project succeeding. And I just wanted to mention a few of them. They're quite straightforward and I think common sense, but maybe it's worth just, sometimes it's useful to articulate them. The first was really getting the right people in the room at the inception of the project. What we saw was that many times it was the top political people in the room saying, I want blockchain, but there was nobody right from the tech community or, nobody who understood what blockchain was, how you could implement it. And even if those people were in the room, it was like a junior engineer who couldn't really have the voice to say, no, what you're proposing actually isn't realistic. It doesn't work. So, but on the other side, we did see, mostly from the private sector side, a lot of technical people getting together and saying, the land is a great use case for this. This is how we would design a blockchain for land project. And it was like, yeah, this looks great on paper, right? But they didn't have the, excuse me, technical or the political people in the room who would kind of give it the political buy-in to succeed. Sorry. The second was, and Jolyne alluded to this, having the right legal regulatory framework in place. So we've seen in several countries where there are laws prohibiting e-signatures, right? That's a significant barrier against adopting blockchain or smart contracts. The other, and we've spoken about this, but it bears repeating, really clearly identifying what is the problem you're trying to solve. Improving people's land tenure security is not a problem that you're trying to solve. That's way too broad, right? Even registering land is not a problem that you're trying to solve. That's too broad. Like blockchain can help in a few specific instances. And I think it's really important first to identify what is your pain point exactly, and then kind of putting blockchain up against it and saying, okay, does this solve it? Too many times I've seen, and this is more back in 2016, 2017, governments of countries where nothing was, all the records were on paper, being interested in putting their records on the blockchain. Again, what are you going to write? Just false start. And I'm trying to think whether there was one other one. Last one, political will. I mean, if the point of blockchain is democratization and preventing fraud and preventing power grabbing, then there are going to be entrenched interests, particularly for an asset like land, who are going to be against it. And they're going to be either explicitly against it or they're going to pay it lip service, but do everything they can behind the scenes not to make it happen. Because by democratizing this asset, you are taking away their ability to profit from it. So it's really important to be also clear-eyed about kind of the political context in the country. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes. We can take some questions.
Let's try and queue up all three that have their hands raised, and then we'll
Start from here.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let's queue them up and then answer them all at once. Okay.
Okay, great. I'm Justin with Trapes on my local token. So thinking more about Honduras than Georgia, what about a situation where there aren't historical records and a blockchain for land solution was implemented, which provided an opportunity for powerful stakeholders or political forces to rewrite the facts on the ground? And then the refugees return to their ancestral lands only to find someone else farming it or having built a mall there. And they go to the public records, which validate the ownership of the current squatter. Then what?
Can we ask all the questions together?
Thank you. Take New York or Manhattan as an example. What the challenges you see to put land titles or apartment registrations, ownership of the apartments or properties on the blockchain? And how long do you foresee this will take? Thank you.
Yeah, can you pass on to them?
Thank you so much. Silvana from ConsenSys. I love everything you said about being pragmatic and picking a clear entry point. My question is about, in these examples where you talked about the point being building trust, and this is a thread that's going to be important throughout a lot of conversations today. The question is, how do we measure impact? So my question is, in projects where you're really trying to get at that trust factor, how do you create a baseline for what trust means for people? And how do you measure the impact of a project like this that's looking to take a really pragmatic approach to building trust? Thanks.
We have one last question. Sure. We can take that and then.
Yeah, thank you. My question is that the exciting thing about the blockchain is not necessarily that it solves problems, but it creates opportunities, right? So one of the great things here is that of all the technologies that I work with in my career, this one has actually created new business models, right? And this is specifically germane to land titles or the value of things that are built on land, right? So the most obvious example here in New York City is where they've taken land titles and they've fractionalized real estate, right? Which is less germane to social good, but it's very easy to see because they take it and they fractionalize it, and then it becomes liquid, and then it can also go into exchanges and build value that way. But I've been involved with some projects somewhat that are still budding that are not about that, but they're more about luxury agricultural goods, so wine, cacao, cannabis, maple syrup, and actually now a lot of superfoods. And so what they're doing is they're fractionalizing the land and they're abstractionizing it, and then they're actually using the governance system to try to create economies that also have social good for the people can share, right? It breaks down a lot for transportation, but I'm wondering whether you folks who are more expert in this have any experience with this, because it's actually fairly exciting if you can take the title and the enterprise that sits on the land, actually fractionalize it, and then use the governance as the business model.
All right, so we've got
3 minutes to go.
in this case, we've got a few minutes. We're going to rapid fire. If they don't answer your question, come talk to them afterwards. Yeah. But we've got no records historically, that issue. We've got what would be the challenges to putting to Manhattan real estate, and also then we've got the trust. Like, how do you measure trust? How do you measure the impact, or even a baseline of trust? And then we've got, have you seen any examples of sort of new business models, such as the luxury agriculture good, like the gentleman mentioned? Go.
Okay, really quickly. On the question about no historical records, that's exactly the problem that Yuliya and I were trying to point out, and it's exactly the reason of getting the right people in the room, including people who know how to go about the process of documenting land rights in a way that resolves disputes, corrects historical errors, and I mean, yeah, you point exactly. It's really dangerous to slap a blockchain on a registry that has 10% of the properties, and those who knows how those records were created originally or how the land was gotten originally, right? So, a blockchain accompanying some of the projects that are doing the hard work to create a baseline that recognizes the rights of everyone, including people who are well off, but especially the rights of people who have been historically disadvantaged, whether they're refugees, displaced people, indigenous peoples, just poor people, right? So that is the solution to that is I have also said, like, if you just put a blockchain solution on and then there's a problem, so the person comes back and they find that, what will the courts of law do? So I heard a really fascinating talk, and it was probably online by a European lawyer at a World Bank conference about 2 years ago, where he talked about how these new technologies are creating lots of opportunities, but they're also kind of, software is becoming the law. And so there's a real need to pay attention again to the policy framework to prevent that scenario from happening, but also a responsibility on those who are implementing solutions to get the right people at the table, as Yuliya said. I think I'll let Yuliya answer about trust building, but on the value chain, so the example I gave in Honduras with heifer is a kind of less developed country example of trying to create that opportunity and bring a couple of different opportunities together. If you're interested in the fractionalized asset side of it, I think you should really talk to Anshal if you get a chance. She's not here, but I'm sure that Alex or someone can connect you, because she's spending a lot of time exactly on looking at that in the context of some of the countries that we're working on in international development. Thank you.
Yeah, just really quickly, because I know that we're out of time. Trust, I love that question. I mean, in some ways, I think use equals trust. You know, part of the test of whether people trust a system is if they use it. So what we see in a lot of contexts is land transactions take place off the books, partly because people don't trust the formal system. So I would say if formal use of the system improves, that's one indicator of trust. It's not a perfect one. And then, of course, there are all of the usual ways of surveying people before, after, but those have their own problems. In terms of, new use cases or opportunities, actually, the one I'm really interested in and quite bullish on is self-sovereign identity. and kind of the decentralized ledger basis of SSI for land tenure. In much of the world, the pieces of evidence that people have to present in order to get a land document. So, for example, a notarized form or a survey plan by a professional surveyor. Those pieces of evidence are inaccessible to much of the population. So, as we're walking around with sensors in our pockets and our entire lives are online, what is the opportunity of us actually harnessing some of our digital trails and presenting them as evidence of our property claims or our property occupancy, right? And, as we move in that direction, a natural first question is, okay, how do you do that in a way that preserves the privacy of the user, in a way that the land registry will trust and accept? How do you issue verified credentials? And for that, I think that self-sovereign identity is emerging as a really interesting solution. So, New York, I'm not sure. You kind of put me on the spot. I'll have to think about that one a little bit. Perhaps the, fractionalized ownership. I don't know how, I couldn't even begin to estimate how long it would take.
But the paper that you mentioned by Mike Aurelia,
Yeah.
that and Chris Mellon, that talks about maybe one of the better use cases would be leasehold. So I don't know if you were talking about condominium property or leasing apartments, but that paper might be a good read also for you.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all very much. Round of applause for our panel.